Mother Bear brings her dying cub to a widow's house. What she did was unbelievable. The wind howled like a wounded beast across the tundra, slamming sheets of ice against the thick glass windows of the remote meteorological station. Inside, Maria Jensen sat hunched over a steaming mug of coffee, eyes flicking between blinking data readouts and the endless swirl of snow on the monitors. The storm was intensifying faster than forecasted, low-pressure systems crashing into one another with chaotic force, weaving a white shroud around the lonely outpost that had been her home for nearly 4 years. Maria adjusted the volume on the radio, but static hissed back at her, a familiar silence this far north. She didn't mind. Solitude had become her companion, a quiet agreement between herself and the frozen world she now inhabited. Ever since Eric's death, she'd sought this silence, this distance. People had tried to reach her at first, sympathetic colleagues, her sister in Minnesota, even old friends from her NOAA days. But the further she pushed into Alaska's vast wilderness, the fewer calls came. Eventually, even the well-intended check-ins stopped. Out here, she could breathe. Out here, she could forget. She stood, stretching the stiffness from her shoulders, and walked toward the front window. The storm's breath had coated the glass in frost, but between shifting gusts she could still see the yard light casting a faint glow against the snowdrifts. The world outside was both beautiful and terrifying, raw and untamed. Maria had grown to respect it. She checked the heater in the generator room, secured the food supplies, and ran a final system diagnostic. The wind's roar grew deeper, like the low growl of something ancient prowling the edge of human comprehension. With everything secure, she returned to her desk, planning to settle in for a long, sleepless night of monitoring and note-taking. That was when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A thud, deep and solid, against the front deck, followed by a scraping, dragging noise. Maria froze, pulse spiking. She reached instinctively for the flare gun mounted by the door, not because she expected to use it, but because that was what people did in remote Alaska when something unfamiliar broke the silence. Cautiously, she moved to the window. At first, she saw nothing, just the same endless white. Then a darker shape appeared at the edge of the porch light's reach, massive and still. Her breath caught in her throat. A grizzly bear, easily 8 feet tall if it stood, though now it remained hunched forward, its breath forming thick clouds in the frigid air. It wasn't moving toward the station, wasn't pawing or growling. It just stood there. And in its mouth, swinging gently from its jaws, was something small, something limp. The bear stepped forward, deliberate and slow, until it reached the top step of the porch. Maria's body tensed, heart thundering. But instead of advancing, the bear lowered its head, gently placing the small form on the wooden planks. Then, almost ceremonially, it stepped backward, once, twice, until its massive form disappeared just beyond the edge of the light. Maria stood frozen for a moment longer, unsure whether she was witnessing reality or a dream stitched together from loneliness and storm noise. But the shape on the porch didn't vanish. It was still there, a dark little bundle, unmoving in the snow. Driven by instinct more than thought, Maria opened the door, bracing herself against the biting wind. The cold knifed through her layers, but she ignored it, her eyes locked on the small figure, a bear cub. Its fur was crusted with snow and ice, its limbs slack. Breath, if it had any, was far too faint to see. She hesitated, torn between fear and compassion, then dropped to her knees and touched its side. Still warm. Faint, fluttering heartbeat. She scooped the cub up in her arms, surprisingly light despite its size, and hurried back inside. The door slammed shut behind her, muffling the wind. She laid the cub on a pile of old towels near the heater and began working without hesitation, blankets, hot water bottles, and a few emergency first aid supplies she kept for wildlife encounters. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She rubbed its limbs gently, coaxing blood flow, whispering nonsense under her breath as though the sound of a human voice could anchor the cub to life. Its breathing was shallow but steadying. Maria removed the bits of ice from its fur, wrapped it tighter, and continued to monitor. Hours passed. She lost track of time, her coffee gone cold on the table, data monitors blinking unobserved. Every so often, she glanced out the window. The bear, the mother, was still there, just a shadow now, motionless beyond the tree line. Barely visible, yet somehow luminous in the storm-filtered moonlight. She hadn't left. She was waiting. Maria felt something shift inside her, an ache she had long buried beneath schedules and solitude. It was the same ache she'd felt the night they told her Eric's body had been found, buried beneath a collapsed ridge during a sudden snowstorm. He had loved the wild, trusted it, and it had taken him anyway. Since then, Maria had chosen distance, safety, control. But here was this bear, having crossed that same treacherous wilderness, not out of instinct alone, but for help. She had brought her cub not to shelter, but to another living being. To her. The realization settled over Maria like a blanket, heavy, strange, comforting. Near dawn, the cub stirred. Just a twitch at first, then a soft, high-pitched sound, half whimper, half yawn. Maria leaned in, her heart catching. The cub opened its eyes briefly, glassy, unfocused, but alive. It nestled deeper into the blankets, its breathing stronger now. Maria exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. She stood and walked to the door, hesitant but drawn. The wind had quieted, the snow falling gently now in fat, soft flakes. She opened the door. The cub, as if sensing something, raised its head. Maria gently lifted it, wrapped in her arms, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold snapped at her cheeks, but she barely noticed. At the edge of the woods, the mother bear stood tall, unmoving. Maria lowered the cub onto the snow, letting it find its legs. It stumbled at first, then righted itself, walking with slow, uncertain steps toward the waiting shadow. The mother bear moved forward and sniffed the cub gently, then nuzzled it with a sound so low it was barely audible. Then she turned her gaze to Maria. Their eyes met across the frozen space, and in that stillness, there was no fear, no danger, only something vast and unspoken. Recognition, perhaps. Trust. Gratitude. Maria didn't move. She didn't need to. The bear gave one slow blink, then turned and disappeared into the trees, her cub following close behind, leaving only a trail of soft prints in the snow. Maria stood on the porch long after they were gone, her arms empty but her heart strangely full. Behind her, the station hummed softly. Inside, the warmth waited. But she remained outside, watching the sky lighten with the first hint of dawn. The storm receding. The world exhaling. For the first time in years, Maria Jensen felt something bloom in her chest that she hadn't dared name. Not yet. Not quite. But it felt a little like hope. The station had returned to stillness, but Maria Jensen could feel that something in her world had fundamentally shifted. She spent the morning moving as if in a trance, checking instruments, logging storm data, resetting solar backup panels. Tasks she had performed 1,000 times now carried a kind of fragile weight, as though each button pressed or screen touched was part of a larger rhythm she had only just begun to understand. Outside, the Alaskan wilderness sparkled under a brittle winter sun. The storm had passed, leaving everything glazed in ice and silence. But Maria kept glancing toward the edge of the trees where the bear had vanished with her cub, half expecting them to return. She didn't know why. It wasn't rational. Wild animals didn't show gratitude. They didn't seek out human help. And yet every instinct she had, quieted and dulled by years of scientific detachment and emotional hibernation, insisted that what she had witnessed wasn't a fluke. It was something else. Something wordless and extraordinary. She hadn't slept, not really. After the bear had gone, Maria had remained outside until the cold forced her in. She spent hours journaling every detail, not just for herself but because she knew somewhere deep inside, that people would question the story. They'd call it anthropomorphizing, say she projected meaning onto a wild creature's behavior. And maybe she had. But the facts were indisputable. A grizzly mother had brought her dying cub to a human doorstep, waited silently through the night, and then accepted the cub back without a sound, without aggression. It wasn't something she could explain away with behavioral biology. It felt like a conversation without language. By mid-morning, Maria finally sat down at her workstation and composed an incident report, dry, factual, properly formatted. But at the end, her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. Then she added one final note in the comments field: cub presented to doorstep by mother bear. No signs of threat. Behavior appeared deliberate. Animal remained nearby for hours. Emotional perception observed. Impression of trust, or something close to it. She knew it wasn't standard, but it was the truth. She uploaded the file, not thinking much of it, and resumed her duties. 2 days passed in quiet routine, no further signs of the bears. But on the third morning, her satellite phone rang, a sound so unfamiliar it startled her. She picked it up, expecting a NOAA supervisor, maybe someone reviewing the anomaly in her report. Instead, a voice crackled through the static, warm and curious. "Maria Jensen? This is Dr. Hannah Rivers, wildlife biologist. I read your log entry about the bear cub. Do you have a moment to talk?" Maria blinked in surprise. "You read that?" she asked, already aware of how ridiculous the question sounded. Of course someone read it. The system was public, after all. But still, she hadn't expected it to catch attention so quickly, or from someone like Dr. Rivers, whose papers on animal cognition she'd quietly admired for years. "I did," Hannah said. "And I'll be honest, it's one of the most fascinating things I've come across in a long time. Do you mind if I fly out there? I'd love to see the site firsthand, maybe run a few observations." Maria hesitated. She wasn't used to company. She wasn't sure how she felt about turning this deeply personal experience into data. But something in Hannah's voice, curious, respectful, reassured her. "All right," she said. "If the weather holds, you'll have clear skies for the next 48 hours. 3 days later, a twin-engine bush plane landed on the flat expanse near the station. Maria met Hannah at the door, surprised by how young she looked, mid-30s, maybe, bundled in layers, hair in a braid under her hat, eyes sharp and friendly. They exchanged few words at first, moving together into the cold to examine the spot where the bear had placed her cub. The porch still bore faint scuff marks from paws, and near the tree line Maria had marked where the mother had stood. Hannah walked in slow circles, silent, then pulled out her notebook and began sketching. Inside, over coffee and freeze-dried stew, they began to talk in earnest. Maria recounted every detail of the night, careful not to exaggerate, but unwilling to omit the deeper feelings that had accompanied each moment. Hannah listened intently, not interrupting, her expression unreadable. When Maria finished, there was a long pause. "What you're describing," Hannah said finally, "doesn't fit neatly into existing behavioral models. Bears are intelligent, deeply so, but this feels like more than just instinct." She tapped her pen against her notebook. "You said it felt like she was asking for help?" Maria nodded slowly. "Not in words. Not in actions either, really. Just the way she looked at me. The way she waited." Hannah leaned back, thoughtful. "I've studied maternal behavior in polar bears, black bears, even brown bears in Canada. They'll fight. They'll flee. But this submission, this trust. I've never heard of anything like it." She paused. "There's a legend," she added almost sheepishly, "from the Gwich'in people in the interior, about a spirit bear called the Midnight Sentinel. Supposedly it watches over the lost and vulnerable. No one's seen it, not really, but your story, it reminds me of that." Maria gave a faint smile. "I'm a scientist. I don't usually put stock in legends." "Me neither," Hannah said. "But sometimes stories exist because they're trying to explain something science hasn't caught up to yet." That night they set up trail cams along the edge of the woods, hoping the bear might return. Maria watched Hannah work, impressed by her calm presence, the methodical ease with which she moved through snow and shadow. For the first time in years, Maria didn't feel the gnawing ache of loneliness pressing in. Instead, she felt oddly seen. Connected. Later, by the fire, Hannah looked up from her notebook. "Do you think she'll come back?" "I don't know," Maria said. "But I'd like to think she knows she can." They talked late into the night, about animal intelligence, about grief, about the spaces between humans and the natural world that sometimes blurred under strange and beautiful circumstances. Hannah told stories of tracking wolves across the Brooks Range, of sitting quietly for hours to watch a wolverine den from half a mile away. Maria, in turn, shared her own memories, of hiking with Eric, of the avalanche that had taken him, of the silence that followed. By the time they both drifted off to sleep, Maria in her bunk, Hannah on the pull-out cot, the station felt warmer than it had in years. Something had changed. Not just because of the bear. Not just because of Hannah. But because, for the first time, Maria was beginning to believe that even in the frozen heart of the world, life could find its way back in. When morning came, the trail cams held nothing, no movement, no shapes. The snow had fallen again during the night, erasing all tracks. But Maria didn't feel disappointed. She felt patient, the kind of patience born from knowing that something rare had passed through her life, and might, just might, return again. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm unlike anything Maria Jensen had experienced before. Life at the station, once marked by routine data collection and long stretches of silence, now carried a current of possibility just beneath its surface. Hannah Rivers extended her stay, claiming she needed more time to document the area and analyze behavioral data. But Maria suspected it was more than that. There was something about the place, or perhaps about what had happened, that neither of them wanted to leave behind too quickly. Every morning they checked the trail cams. Sometimes there were blurred images of foxes or a moose wandering through snowdrifts. But the bear and her cub never appeared again. At first, Maria felt a twinge of disappointment. But as the days wore on, that feeling softened into something quieter, more reflective. Maybe the bear didn't need to return. Maybe what had happened had already served its purpose. They began taking short treks into the surrounding woods, careful not to disturb the terrain too much, mapping out potential den sites. Hannah was meticulous in her tracking, often crouching beside a half-melted paw print or brushing her fingers along the claw marks on a distant tree trunk, her breath fogging the air as she murmured observations to herself. Maria found herself following close behind, absorbing every word, every motion. It surprised her how natural the partnership felt. She had spent so long avoiding connection, so long wrapping herself in solitude like a thermal blanket. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed the simple act of sharing space with someone who understood wonder the way she did. One afternoon, as they rested near a frozen creek, Hannah pulled a small journal from her pack and began sketching something in silence. Maria watched her, curious. "You always draw your subjects?" she asked after a moment. Hannah looked up, smiling. "Always. Even if it's just paw prints or movement patterns. Sometimes the pen captures what the camera can't." She turned the journal around, revealing a soft charcoal rendering of the mother bear. Maria stared at it, stunned. The shading was delicate but powerful, the eyes in particular carrying a weight that felt unsettlingly real. "You got her," she said, her voice low. "That's what she looked like." "I wasn't sure," Hannah replied. "But I couldn't stop thinking about the way you described her gaze. I've seen hundreds of bears, but this one, she feels different." She paused, then added, "Have you thought more about why she came to you, Maria?" Hesitated. "Every day. And every day I come up with a different answer. Instinct. Desperation. Maybe she saw me through the window once and remembered the shape. Maybe it wasn't anything special. But then I remember how she waited, and how she didn't leave until the cub was strong enough. That doesn't feel like chance." Hannah nodded. "It doesn't to me either." That evening, as the wind picked up again and clouds drifted low across the sky, Maria received an unexpected call on the station's satellite line. It was a regional reporter from Anchorage. Apparently, someone at NOAA had flagged her incident report and passed it along. The story had been picked up by a wildlife advocacy blog, and now journalists were asking questions. Maria froze, unsure how to respond. She hadn't written that report for publicity. It had been a record, personal, detailed, but never meant for public eyes. Hannah took the call from her hands gently. "I'll handle it," she said. Over the next few days, she carefully shaped the story into something truthful yet respectful, emphasizing the importance of wildlife empathy, non-invasive research, and the profound mysteries that science couldn't always explain. She never used Maria's name directly, only referring to her as a field technician. When Maria asked why, Hannah looked at her with quiet understanding. "Because this story isn't just yours anymore. But you're part of it, your piece, you should keep." In the weeks that followed, the story spread far beyond what either of them expected. It was picked up by national outlets, then international ones. Scientists debated it. Conservationists praised it. And skeptics dismissed it. But among the noise, something else emerged, an undercurrent of fascination. Letters and emails poured in from people around the world, some sharing similar stories, others simply moved by the idea that a bear could cross the line between wild and human in a moment of trust. One letter stood out. It was from an elder of the Tanana Athabascan people whose ancestors had lived along the river valleys for centuries. The letter was handwritten, graceful in its simplicity. It read, The midnight scent has walked these lands for longer than stories remember. Sometimes it takes the form of a bear. Sometimes a shadow in the trees. It appears when the world begins to forget itself, when humans forget their place among the breathing. What you saw was no accident. It was a reminder. Maria read it 3 times, the words ringing louder each time. A reminder. She thought back to that first night, the snow, the silence, the weight of the cub in her arms. How for just a few hours, everything had felt larger, more sacred. How she had felt something awaken that had long been buried. And now, that sense of awakening echoed through every moment, every meal shared with Hannah, every step into the snow-covered woods, every glance toward the horizon. One morning, as dawn lit the landscape in shades of gold and blue, Hannah pulled out a folded map and laid it across the table. "I've been thinking," she said. "There's a small wildlife reserve about 80 miles south of here. Mostly forest and river. Rarely monitored. What if we petitioned for a field outpost there? A place to study long-term behavior, bears, wolves, moose, not just with cameras, but with real observation. You could lead the weather tracking. I could run the biological data. Together, we could make it something unique." Maria stared at the map, emotions surging all at once, fear, excitement, disbelief. "You want to build a station with me?" Hannah smiled. "Why not? We're already halfway there." It took weeks of proposals, emails, and quiet bureaucratic nudging, but eventually, NOAA approved a temporary research grant. Maria and Hannah packed the station carefully, ensuring all equipment was properly stored. On their final evening, Maria stood once more on the porch, looking toward the tree line. The snow had begun to fall again, thick and slow. She didn't expect to see the bear, not really, but a part of her hoped. Hoped for one last glimpse. A shape in the dark. A sign that something sacred had passed through her life and left a mark. Nothing moved. Only the wind. And yet, in the silence, Maria felt something settle inside her. Not an answer. Not closure. But a kind of calm. A knowing. The bear had come. The cub had lived. And Maria had remembered what it meant to care, to risk, to reach out when it mattered. That was enough. She turned back inside, closing the door behind her. The future was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of it. Spring came slowly to the Alaskan interior, the deep snow grudgingly retreating under the lengthening sun, revealing soaked earth, brittle branches, and the silent remnants of winter's grip. In the months that followed their departure from the original station, Maria Jensen and Dr. Hannah Rivers established a new field outpost along the wide, winding edge of the Togiak River Reserve. The place was raw and beautiful, ringed by dense pine forests and broad glacial valleys. And though more accessible than the remote station where the bear had come to her door, it still held the sacred solitude of wild country. They named the new site Aurora Point, in honor of the first morning Maria had stood outside and watched the world exhale after the storm. With funding from a special grant focused on non-invasive behavioral study, they began a new chapter of work, observing, listening, recording. Not just for the sake of data, but for the space between facts. The subtle places where science brushed against something older, quieter, and harder to define. Each morning, they rose before the sun, hiking out to various points along the reserve's narrow trails, checking motion-triggered cameras, documenting bear paths, collecting fur samples caught in snag lines, and recording audio logs of nocturnal activity. Over time, the patterns began to emerge, tracks and claw marks from a large grizzly and at least 2 smaller cubs. No conclusive identification could be made, but Maria felt it in her bones. She knew it was her, the same mother bear. Or perhaps a different one, cut from the same thread of something eternal and instinctive and wise. Hannah never said it outright, but Maria could sense that she believed it too. There was a reverence in the way she spoke of the bear, not with the detachment of a scientist alone, but with the caution of someone who had glimpsed a threshold and chosen to honor it. One afternoon in late May, while reviewing footage from a camera hidden near a shallow bend in the river, Maria froze. The image was blurry, half obscured by fog and tree branches, but the shape was unmistakable. A massive bear stood at the edge of the water, her head low, eyes turned toward the camera. Not aggressive. Not startled. Just aware. Behind her, a cub nuzzled into her side. And then, just before the recording ended, the bear lifted her snout, stared straight at the lens, and blinked once. Maria rewound the footage and played it again. The same blink. The same stillness. The same quiet recognition that had haunted her memory since that night in the snow. She called Hannah over, her hands trembling slightly. They watched it together, wordless. "It's her," Maria whispered finally. "She found us." Hannah said nothing for a moment, then smiled softly. "Or maybe," she replied, "we found each other again." In the days that followed, they tracked the bear from a distance, never approaching, never disrupting her space. They marked her movement through the valley, mapping her routine. She never came close to the cabin, never crossed into their direct path. But she was there. Always at the edge of sight, a shadow between the trees, a shape slipping behind a ridge, as if she understood the boundary they had drawn and chose to honor it. Maria began recording long audio logs at night, not just of the data they collected, but of her thoughts, her feelings, the slow unraveling of her grief, and the rebuilding that had quietly begun. She spoke of Eric sometimes, not in sorrow, but in gratitude. How his love for the world had once drawn them together. How the silence after his loss had hollowed her out. And how the bear, on that impossible night, had offered something no human could. Not comfort. Not answers. But the simplest of miracles, a life placed in her hands. A reason to act. To care. To begin again. One evening, while cataloging prints near a meadow, they encountered a group of schoolchildren and their guide from a nearby village. The guide, an older man with silver hair and a steady voice, listened to their story as they walked together. When Maria described the night the mother bear came to her door, he grew still. "My grandmother used to speak of such things," he said. "Of animals who remember kindness, who know when they are being seen, not just looked at, but seen." He bent down and traced one of the prints with his hand. "You've walked into old stories," he said, "and now they walk with you." Word of their work continued to grow, not in the viral blaze of the first story, but in quiet ripples among the conservation community. Other scientists reached out, not just to analyze the bear's behavior but to collaborate on broader studies about empathy, trauma recovery, and cross-species recognition. Maria and Hannah began co-authoring papers, blending hard data with narrative observation, always careful to respect the wild and the mystery it carried. In conferences and forums, they shared not just what they knew, but what they didn't, and that honesty became their signature. They were no longer trying to prove a point, they were simply bearing witness. As summer bloomed fully, the valley transformed, green and gold replacing white and blue, the wind warm now, the days long and slow. Maria took to walking at twilight, just before the first stars appeared. Sometimes Hannah joined her, sometimes not. One night, as the sky turned a deep lavender and the insects hummed in low chorus, Maria stood at the edge of a ridge and looked out over the valley. She thought of the bear, somewhere below, leading her cub through the trees, teaching it what to eat, where to rest, how to survive. She thought of herself, once broken by loss, now reshaped by something she couldn't name. She remembered what Hannah had said weeks ago, that they had found each other again, and she realized it was true. The bear had come to her not out of weakness, but out of hope. A quiet, deliberate hope that another being would respond not with fear, but with care. That hope had crossed the boundary between wild and human. And Maria had answered. That answer had echoed into everything since, into the building of the new station, the study, the friendship, the healing. It had become a thread connecting her past and her future. And though the bear might never return to her porch, that thread remained. She closed her eyes, breathing in the dusk. Somewhere nearby, an owl called. A breeze moved through the trees. And in that moment, Maria Jensen understood that her life had changed, not because of fame or research, or even because of the bear, but because, in the loneliest place she had ever known, someone had knocked on her door. And she had chosen to open it. Autumn crept in without warning, soft and golden at first, then suddenly sharp and wind-bitten, reminding Maria Jensen of how quickly things in the wilderness changed. At Aurora Point, the trees began to burn with color, crimson, amber, ochre, and the river slowed, its surface occasionally glossed with thin ice in the early morning hours. The days shortened. The nights came faster, and with them, a deeper stillness that settled over the land like a second skin. Maria welcomed it. After months of steady work, long days cataloging footage and long nights cross-referencing behavioral patterns, she found herself craving silence again. Not the hollow silence of grief, but the kind that held memory. The kind that let things echo in your bones without demanding explanation. Hannah stayed on, and the rhythm between them had grown seamless. They had built something together, something more than a research station. Something that felt like a sanctuary. They still tracked the bear's movements through the valley, still spoke her name in quiet chant. Though they never saw her directly again, her presence lingered, not in footprints or photographs, but in the way they moved through the forest, in the reverence with which they approached every living creature. She had become myth and memory, both a symbol and a truth. A reminder that even in the wildest places, connection was possible. One evening, as the sky deepened into an indigo twilight and a thin frost kissed the edge of the windowpane, Maria sat at her desk reviewing recent footage. The screen showed a cluster of elk moving through a clearing, a red fox darting through the underbrush, then, barely visible, a shape in the far background. Too large to be anything but a bear. Too far to identify. But something about the gait, the way it paused to look over its shoulder, made Maria's breath catch. She leaned forward, pausing the frame, enhancing it slightly. There was no detail. No certainty. But the feeling returned, the same one she'd felt the night the bear had come to her door. The hair on her arms stood on end. She turned to call for Hannah, but stopped. Instead, she sat back in her chair and stared at the still frame, a faint smile on her lips. Maybe it didn't matter if it was her. Maybe what mattered was that Maria still felt it, still believed. The next morning, Maria and Hannah hiked to one of the ridgelines overlooking the valley. The air was crisp and thin, and a few flurries danced on the wind, hinting at the winter to come. They walked in companionable silence until they reached a small outcropping, where the trees fell away and the whole valley unfolded below them, brutal and untouched, a tapestry of fading color and soft mist. Maria stood there for a long time, breathing it in. Hannah eventually joined her, hands tucked into her coat pockets, eyes scanning the horizon. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't opened that door?" she asked quietly. Maria didn't answer right away. She thought back to that night, the snow, the fear, the trembling cub in her arms. Then she nodded slowly. "I'd still be alive. Probably still doing my job. Still surviving. But I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be this version of me." Hannah smiled softly. "You're not the only one," she changed. They sat on the ridge until the cold began to nip at their cheeks and the clouds rolled heavier in the distance. As they turned back, Maria looked over her shoulder one last time, half expecting to see a shadow at the tree line. There was nothing but trees and wind. And still, it felt like goodbye. Back at the cabin, they began preparing for winter. Supplies were checked. Snow gear laid out. Emergency systems tested. The transition was always serious business this far north, but they approached it with a quiet steadiness, a practiced calm. One night, during one of their last outdoor hikes before the deep snows came, Hannah turned to Maria under the starlight. "I've been thinking," she said. "When this season ends, I'm not going back to Seattle." Maria blinked. "You're not?" "No," Hannah said. "I want to stay here. With the work. With this place. With you." Maria felt a warmth rise in her chest that had nothing to do with the firelight or the gear they wore. "I'd like that," she said simply. "A lot." Winter came hard and early that year. The snow arrived in thick waves, burying the trails, muffling the world. At night, the wind howled against the walls like it had that night long ago, but Maria no longer felt fear in the sound. Instead, it felt like an old friend returning, wild and loud and full of stories. On one particularly cold evening, Maria stood at the cabin's front door, the same way she had at the old station, and opened it to the wind. She didn't expect anything to be there. And there wasn't. But she stood there anyway, listening, remembering, offering. They continued their work through the winter, tracking from a distance, gathering long-term climate and migration data, building relationships with nearby indigenous communities who began to visit the station more frequently, sharing knowledge and stories passed down through generations. One elder, a woman named Elsie who had lived most of her life in the region, came one day bearing a carved wooden totem. It was a bear, standing tall, one paw raised, eyes wide and kind. "She came to you," Elsie said simply, placing it in Maria's hands. "Not because you were chosen, but because you were open." Maria kept the totem on her desk. And every morning, she touched its smooth surface, a silent gesture of thanks. For the bear. For the storm. For the pain and the healing and the winding path between. As the first signs of spring returned months later, Maria sat on the cabin steps, journal in hand. She wrote not as a scientist or researcher, but as someone who had witnessed something sacred. Her final entry read, "There are things that cannot be measured. The weight of a gaze. The silence of trust. The moment when a wild creature brings its wounded to your door. These are not stories to be proven. They are stories to be kept. And I will keep this one for the rest of my life." Inside, Hannah was preparing tea, humming softly to herself. Outside, the trees stirred with the first winds of thaw. Somewhere in the valley, whether in body or in memory, the bear moved. Watching, perhaps. or simply living her wild, unknowable life. But Maria no longer needed proof. She no longer needed another visit. What the bear had given her that night was never just a moment. It was a door. And Maria had stepped through it, into grief, into wonder, into something that felt, finally, like home.